a racist officer who targeted the wrong man, only to find out his true identity in the most unexpected place. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped lazily in the trees, and the faint hum of a lawnmower echoed in the distance. It was the kind of afternoon that felt peaceful, unless you were the man walking down the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. He was tall, dressed in a crisp navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted. To anyone passing by, he looked like a professional, maybe a lawyer or a businessman. But the way his shoulders tensed ever so slightly, the way his eyes flicked toward the street every few steps, told a different story. This wasn't just a stroll. It was a walk he had taken 1,000 times before, always aware of the eyes on him. Another day, he thought, his jaw tightening. Another set of eyes following me. But today felt different. The neighborhood was familiar, yet it never felt like home. The perfectly trimmed hedges, the white picket fences, it was a picture of suburban bliss. But for him, it was a stage where he was always the outsider. He adjusted his cufflinks, a small habit he had developed to steady his nerves. In the distance, a patrol car turned the corner, its slow crawl catching his attention. He didn't stop walking, didn't change his pace, but his chest tightened. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. The scene was set, the calm before the storm. And in that moment, everything felt ordinary, until it wasn't. The patrol car rolled to a stop just a few feet away, its tires crunching against the gravel on the side of the road. The man in the suit didn't break his stride, but his heart rate picked up. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze before he even heard the voice. "Hey, you!" the officer barked, stepping out of the car. His tone was sharp, cutting through the calm of the afternoon like a knife. "Stop right there. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The man paused, turning slowly to face the officer. He kept his hands visible, his expression calm but firm. "Just taking a walk, officer," he replied, his voice steady. "Is that a problem?" The officer narrowed his eyes. His hand rested on the holster at his side. He took a step closer, his boots heavy against the pavement. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "This is a quiet area. We don't get a lot of strangers walking around." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I'm not a stranger," he said evenly. "I live here, just like everyone else." The officer scoffed, his eyes scanning the man from head to toe. "Yeah, let's see some ID then. Prove it." For a moment, the man hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him, curtains twitching in windows, a few people stopping on the sidewalk to watch. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. "Here," he said, his voice calm but laced with quiet defiance. "Take a look." The officer snatched the ID, his eyes darting over it. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, doubt, maybe, or irritation. "Stay right there," he ordered, turning back to his car. "I need to run this." The man stood still, his hands at his sides. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The officer's voice crackled over the radio, but the words were muffled, distant. The man's mind raced, but he kept his face neutral, his posture relaxed. He had been here before, too many times to count. But this time, something felt different. This time, he wasn't going to let it slide. The officer returned, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said, his voice low. "You're coming with me." The man raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" "Suspicious activity," the officer shot back. "Now, turn around. Hands behind your back." The man's stomach dropped, but he didn't argue. He knew better. As the cuffs clicked into place, he glanced at the growing crowd, their faces a mix of shock and anger. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much bigger, and it was only just beginning. The patrol car's back seat was cold and cramped, the faint smell of disinfectant and stale coffee lingering in the air. The man sat upright, his cuffed hands resting in his lap, his face calm but his mind racing. He could hear the officer muttering into the radio, the occasional crackle of static breaking the tense silence. The car pulled into the station, and the officer yanked open the door, gesturing for him to get out. "Move," the officer said, his voice clipped. "Let's go." The man stepped out, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with a soft click. He walked ahead, his shoulders squared, refusing to let the humiliation show. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the scuffed linoleum floors. A few officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and indifference. The officer led him to a small, windowless room, gesturing for him to sit. "Wait here," he said, his tone dismissive. "Someone will be in to process you." The man sat down, his hands still cuffed, his eyes scanning the room. It was bare, just a table, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This isn't the end, he thought. This is just the beginning. Minutes passed, the silence pressing in on him. Finally, the door opened, and a different officer walked in, holding a clipboard. He glanced at the man, then down at the paperwork in his hands. "All right," he said, his tone bored. "Let's get this over with." "Name?" The man met his gaze, his voice steady. "James Carter." The officer scribbled something down, not looking up. "And what were you doing in that neighborhood, Mr. Carter?" "I was taking a walk," the man replied, his tone even. "I live there." The officer snorted, shaking his head. "Right, and I'm the president. Let's try that again. What were you really doing?" The man's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I already told you. I was taking a walk. That's it." The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "You expect me to believe that? A guy like you, dressed like that, just wandering around? Come on, Carter, what's your game?" The man didn't respond, his eyes locked on the officer's. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Finally, the officer sighed, standing up. "Fine. Have it your way. We'll see what the judge has to say." He walked out, leaving the man alone again. The door clicked shut, and the man leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew what was coming next, and he was ready. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. The man stood at the front of the room, his cuffs now removed, his suit slightly wrinkled but still impeccable. The judge sat high on the bench, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she shuffled through a stack of papers. The officer who had arrested him stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his expression smug. The judge looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied the man. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice calm but firm. "You've been brought in on charges of suspicious activity and failure to comply with an officer's orders. How do you plead?" The man straightened his tie, his gaze steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The officer snorted, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this man was loitering in a residential area, refusing to provide a valid reason for his presence. When I attempted to question him, he became combative and uncooperative." The judge raised an eyebrow, turning back to the man. "Is this true, Mr. Carter?" The man took a deep breath, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the room lean in. "No, Your Honor. I was simply taking a walk in my own neighborhood. I provided my ID when asked, but the officer chose to escalate the situation without cause." The judge frowned, glancing down at the paperwork again. "Your ID," she said slowly. "Let's see it." The officer stepped forward, handing over the man's ID with a smirk. The judge took it, her eyes scanning the information. For a moment, there was silence. Then her eyes widened, and she looked up at the man, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "Mayor Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room erupted in murmurs. The officer's smirk faded as he turned to stare at the man. "What?" he said, his voice cracking. That's not possible." The man, Mayor James Carter, nodded, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "It's true, Your Honor. I was elected last month. I was taking a walk in my own neighborhood, trying to clear my head after a long day. I never expected to be arrested for it." The judge leaned back in her chair, her face a mix of shock and frustration. She turned to the officer, her voice icy. "Do you realize who you just arrested?" The officer stammered, his face pale. I had no idea, Your Honor." He didn't say anything. "Because I shouldn't have to," the mayor interrupted, his voice firm but not raised. "I shouldn't have to announce who I am to be treated with basic respect and dignity. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been stopped, questioned, or harassed just because of the color of their skin." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "This is unacceptable," she said finally. "Officer, you are dismissed. And Mayor Carter, I apologize for this ordeal." The mayor nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Your Honor. But this isn't just about an apology. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." The judge nodded, her face serious. "Agreed. This court is adjourned." As the gavel came down, the officer slunk out of the room, his head low. The mayor stood tall, his eyes meeting the judge's one last time before he turned and walked out, the murmurs of the courtroom following him like a shadow. The truth was out now, and nothing would ever be the same. The courtroom emptied slowly, the murmurs of the crowd fading as people filed out, their faces a mix of shock and contemplation. Mayor Carter stood near the door, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but his mind racing. The officer who had arrested him was gone, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like a storm cloud. A young woman approached him, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "Mayor Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I can't believe what happened. Are you okay?" He smiled softly, nodding. "I'm fine. But this isn't about me. It's about everyone who's ever been in my shoes, stopped, questioned, or treated like they don't belong. That's what we need to focus on." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been there," she said quietly. "Too many times. It's exhausting." "I know," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "But change starts with moments like this. We have to keep pushing, keep speaking up. It's the only way things will get better." She wiped her eyes, offering a small smile. "Thank you for standing up for all of us." He nodded, watching as she walked away. The weight of her words settled on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden, it was a reminder. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The mayor stood at the podium, the city hall press room buzzing with reporters and cameras. The incident had made headlines, and now everyone wanted to hear his side of the story. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated event," he began, his voice steady but carrying a quiet intensity. "It's a symptom of a much larger problem, one that affects countless people every day. This isn't about blame or punishment. It's about progress." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're launching new training programs for our police force, focusing on bias awareness and community engagement. But real change starts with all of us. It starts with seeing each other as human beings, not stereotypes." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He stepped away from the podium, knowing this was just the first step. The work was far from over, But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Racism isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's in the small, everyday moments, like being stopped for just existing. But change starts when we confront it, one moment at a time. If this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Let's keep the conversation going. Please note, this is not a real story. It's a work of fiction only for education and entertainment purposes.